Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum. More specifically, we're going to be discussing the ETH Bitcoin valuation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I think we are but a few months away, if that, on coming full cycle on the ETH Bitcoin pair. I actually launched my channel in the summer of 2019 and was very vocally bullish on the ETH Bitcoin valuation over here. But I flipped my view on ETH Bitcoin to bearish up here because we knew that the Fed was going to raise rates a lot and they were going to be reducing the size of their balance sheet considerably. And so my reflections on all of this stuff has never been sort of an assessment on Ethereum's fundamental value. It's more so an assessment on monetary policy, right? And I'll try to continue to say that as much as I can because I think it's often misconstrued. A lot of people might say, well, if he's bearish on ETH Bitcoin, that means he's always been bearish on it, which means he's against ETH. And that's not true. I mean, it's just a matter of where we are in the business cycle, where we are in the market cycle. And I think it's a good idea, to just establish that, look, even assets that you might like Ethereum, are going to go through phases where they bleed against Bitcoin. It's always been that way. It'll probably always be that way. And so rather than fight that trend, I think it makes more sense to just say, look, when the Fed is reducing the size of their balance sheet considerably, ETH Bitcoin goes down. And when they're expanding it, ETH Bitcoin tends to go up. And this is one of these battles I've had to fight so many times with people, is to say, this downtrend that you see the ETH Bitcoin pair in, it's more so an artifact of just tighter and tighter monetary policy, just like it was last cycle. Once you see the pivot back to QE, then ETH Bitcoin will likely bottom out. Now, I want to go on the record now and say I do think the bottom for ETH Bitcoin in terms of time is relatively close. I still think the bottom is somewhere between 0.03 to 0.04. That is my base case, and I think it's going to happen sometime this summer. So those are my views. I want to make sure I clearly communicate those views. What I often see a lot of people say is, they'll sort of put out a half view on it, and then when ETH Bitcoin rallies, they'll throw shade my way, and then when it dumps, they'll just, pretend like they didn't do that. But that is my view, and it's based on monetary policy and nothing more. That's what it's based on. And I guess there is a little bit more. I mean, it's not just based on monetary policy. It's also based on the idea that Ethereum is slightly higher risk than Bitcoin, and therefore it's more exposed to regulatory pressure. It's kind of like how the spot ETF for Bitcoin was approved, and while it hopefully eventually the ETH ETF gets approved, it might not get approved this May, and that's just another artifact of regulatory pressure on Ethereum that doesn't really exist in the same way for Bitcoin. So one of the things that we talked about a few weeks ago in this video right here, we made a video on ETH Bitcoin after it had rallied to 0.052. Now, before that video, before this video, the video before it on ETH Bitcoin said that we could see one final bounce by ETH Bitcoin following the Bitcoin halving. And the reason for that is Bitcoin is often sort of like the most vulnerable against ETH just after these major events. If you remember, right after the spot ETF launch, ETH Bitcoin went up, right? You see that? You can see that we had the spot ETF launch right here the week of January 8th, and then right then, that's when ETH Bitcoin shot back up. So when you have these major events, that's when the ETH Bitcoin pair, the bulls for the ETH Bitcoin pair, are going to make their run. They're going to declare the bottom being in for it because it's now past this major event. And that's exactly what happened after the spot ETF. The ETH Bitcoin bulls ran it back up. But as I said, back then, this is likely just a repeat of all of this, right? You get a low or high, you have a lower high, same thing right here. But that if it played out like last cycle, going into the halving, you will see one more attempt for the ETH Bitcoin bulls to try to break the bull market support band, but that it likely will fail. And again, it doesn't mean that it can't go back up one more time, but as I said already, what I thought was going to happen was just after the halving, the ETH Bitcoin bulls run it up one more time, and that is sort of symbolic of those people pricing in the unlikely acceptance of the ETH spot ETF. Now, again, that doesn't mean that I want it to be rejected. I actually like it when we have more things to talk about other than are the ETFs going to be approved or rejected. And if it is rejected, I would have high hopes in the future that it'll eventually be approved. But right now, is it going to be approved? I honestly have no crazy insight into that. I'm just going based on what industry experts are telling me, and they're mostly saying, I mean, not telling me, just telling you guys on Twitter that it's likely not going to happen. And so the initial bounce is sort of the pricing in of maybe, just maybe, it'll be approved. But that as it's not approved, as the probability of being approved goes down, meaning the SEC is not really engaging with anyone regarding the ETH Bitcoin spot or the ETH spot ETF, as they're not really engaging and people kind of are seeing the writing on the wall, that's when the people that initially tried to price that in are like, all right, it's just going to fade back down slowly, which is what it did over here, right? It's exactly what it did over here. Again, I don't think you need a narrative to explain this price action. I'm just saying it wouldn't be that hard to try to assign a narrative to the chart, just like you could have assigned some other narrative to the chart back over there on that bounce. But again, my expectation is that the bull market support band for ETH Bitcoin will guide it down. And the closer you get to the potential rejection of the spot ETF, the more likely it is that you end up taking out this low over here from a month ago. Now, remember, after this low was set in May of 2013, we took that low out about how many weeks later? Let me actually get this exact. So back then it took about 8 weeks to take that low out. I don't know if it's going to take 8 weeks or not. I would tend to think it's not. And the reason for that is it seems like this move over here has been going slightly quicker than the one from back over here. For instance, if you were to take the amount of time that it took to go from, this low right here in late December to the next low, that was 22 weeks, whereas from here to here, it was only about 13 weeks. So it seems like it's moving a little bit quicker. So I don't really think it has to take 8 weeks, but if it did take 8 weeks, that would put it all the way out in June, right? So, I mean, it's possible. But even though it took 8 weeks to break the low, it didn't take 8 weeks to get back down to the low. You can see we actually got back down to the low only 6 weeks later, right? The wick came all the way back down to that low. So if you were to go 6 weeks out from that low, that would put you the week of May 20th, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but I do believe that is the week where we're going to find out one way or another about some of these ETFs, right? Again, I haven't been following it super closely, but I have seen some things saying like May 22nd, May 23rd. I know that the SEC keeps trying to kick the can down the road as much as they can. But, what if it just bleeds back down and then breaks support then? Now, what would likely happen in that scenario is that if it were to break support, it could probably go down relatively quickly over the next 1 month or so. But my view, again, is that if it breaks support, again, which it kind of already has. I mean, it's been breaking it, and it's just been, the market's kind of adjusting to it at these levels. But if it continues to break here and go down, that's probably going to represent the final capitulation process of ETH Bitcoin. And the reason why I feel compelled to tell you about this is because what I think could happen is that if the ETF is rejected and ETH Bitcoin capitulates, then a lot of people are just going to say, they're going to put on their maxi hat, their Bitcoin maxi hat, and say, all right, forget ETH, it's just going to go down on its Bitcoin pair forever. But what if they're wrong, right? What if the reason it has been bleeding has nothing to do with its deflationary mechanism? What if it has nothing to do with proof of stake? What if it has nothing to do with the potential spot ETF rejection? What if it only has to do with monetary policy and slightly increased regulatory pressures? But what if it's just based on monetary policy? And then you get this example down here where ETH Bitcoin bottomed when the Fed started to expand their balance sheet. How poetic would it be? ETH Bitcoin capitulates after ETH spot ETF is rejected, and then people are like, all right, fine, we believe you. But they represent the last capitulation, right? And so once they finally believe, it then bottoms. I'm guessing around 0.03 to 0.04. And the reason for it to bottom would have nothing to do with the spot ETF, which I think is what the headlines would read. It would just have to do with maybe the Fed is about to go back to looser monetary policy, which they've already started to talk about in several different ways. One of those ways is they've said that they're going to slow quantitative tightening down from like 60 billion or something a month to 25 billion. That's something. And there's also some other things that are going on that might actually sort of be seen as stimulating to the economy as well in the next few months. But my point is this: you have to think about what would cause the Fed to go back to looser monetary policy. Is it a coincidence that they're going to go back to looser monetary policy? It's not going to be QE, but it's going to be slightly looser than what it has been because they're going to start tapering QT. Is it a coincidence that they're going to go to 25 billion a month instead of 60 billion a month in June, which is precisely when we said that Bitcoin dominance might top sometime this summer, which is coinciding with when people don't care as much about the markets? So I look at this and I think there's a great opportunity in this idea of ETH Bitcoin bleeds back down around the time of spot ETF rejection. It breaks the lows, capitulates, and then everyone thinks that ETH is done because it looks bad, right? If there's no ETF and Bitcoin has one, they capitulate and then it bottoms. Not because of the spot ETF rejection, but because of looser monetary policy finally arriving. And if you think about it, what would cause the Fed to go back to looser monetary policy? Weakening in the labor market, right? If you go look at the labor market, the unemployment rate, it's at, this is the unemployment level. You look at the unemployment rate, it's at 3.9%. And last May, from April to May, it jumped 0.3. If it were to jump 0.3 from this April to May, that'd put it at 4.2%, right? You can see how it could all correspond perfectly, right? ETF rejected, ETH Bitcoin capitulates, but right then unemployment rate hits 4% or over 4%. And then the Fed goes to looser monetary policy. And then ETH Bitcoin bottoms just when everyone finally believes in the capitulation process, but they're only now believing after the entire move is done. I've been very vocal about my views on ETH Bitcoin for a long time. And, next cycle I'm not going to be, honestly. But I do think that you could easily make the case that you are in sort of this phase right here, where after you break down, it then drops a little bit more over the next couple of months. And I'm going to show you guys a chart that I think is somewhat compelling. But from here, this was a 47% drop. That was a 32% drop from the range, from those lows. If you were to drop just say 15%, that gets you near 0.04. If you were to drop 20%, that gets you to the range that we've been discussing for the last 2.5 years, 0.03 to 0.04. And that's where I think the bottom is on ETH Bitcoin, is 0.03 to 0.04. But it has nothing to do with the spot ETF. I could even envision a scenario where the spot ETF is approved and it still goes down. I mean, wouldn't that be crazy if it were approved? Everyone then freaks out, YOLO's in, and then it still goes down because the market's not based on the spot ETF. It's based on the fact that monetary policy is still tight. Now, there's something I want to address here. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I honestly don't really have the best answer, but I'll try to provide at least an analogy for you. Last cycle, if you buy the idea that ETH Bitcoin bottoms once looser monetary policy arrives, then you're probably also following what the Fed's doing, okay? Because you can see that, that's when it bottomed last cycle, is when looser monetary policy arrived. And so you're probably watching this too, and you're thinking like, all right, well, when's it going to stop going down? They've already said they're likely going to adjust quantitative tightening. They're going to adjust it starting in June, which is exactly when we've said, Bitcoin dominance might top June, July. I don't know what happens if, it does something like this. Like if it goes down and then instead of going down at the same pace, it then does something like this, where it just slightly goes down. You know what I'm saying? Because in that case, you could argue that that is a looser monetary policy, but it's still not QE, right? It's not as bad as before, but it is still QT. And I don't really know, honestly. We only have one example, but what I want to talk about now before it becomes an issue in a month is there might be some merit to this. Something like that could still provide a tailwind for ETH Bitcoin sometime later on this summer. And maybe one way to think about it is like this. All right, let's think you go out on vacation for a week and you get back to your house and the heater or the air conditioning went out while you were gone. I think that's happened to everyone at some point. I know it's happened to me before. And you get back to your house and the air conditioning's been out. And it's the summertime, so you get back and it's like 85 degrees in your house. Now, if it's 85 degrees in your house, you're not going to want to be in there, right? You're going to be in there, you're going to be sweating. It's going to be really hot, right? 85 degrees. And you're probably going to think to yourself, like, gosh, like if only we could get this back to a more reasonable temperature, then I would feel happy, then I'd be happy. But you don't actually have to wait for it to get back to your preferred temperature, like 70 degrees, 72 degrees, or 68, whatever. All you really need to start feeling better is for the air conditioning to come back on. So if it's still 85 degrees, but you're sitting next to the vent where the AC is coming out of, if someone comes over and fixes it, you're going to start feeling better before the room temperature gets back to 70 degrees, right? Even if it's at 82, if you feel the cold air sort of blowing on you, you're going to start feeling better. Markets are forward-looking, right? Once you see it, once the temperature is back to 70 degrees and it's obvious to everyone, then, the low for ETH Bitcoin could be in the rearview mirror. So I think there's a case to be made that you could still see the low this summer on the ETH Bitcoin pair if it were to play out kind of how I've been outlining for the last 2.5 years. Now, again, there is there's a lot of people that are saying the low is already in. And look, they could be right? And I've said before, if you did what I did and we're looking at this market back over here and thinking, all right, it makes sense to stick with Bitcoin over ETH until looser monetary policy arrives, you could trade some of it back even at these levels and still be way in the money and just, deal with it if it goes down a little bit more. But my point is that, we've seen this pattern many times before. By many, I mean two. And the way it eventually resolved was to the downside. There's one really interesting way to look at ETH Bitcoin, and that's by 6-month candles. And I want to show you this because I was looking at it. I'm like, we're getting close in terms of time. I don't know how close we are in terms of valuation, but I think we're getting close in terms of time, meaning I do think we're likely only, potentially 1 month away to 3 months away from the bottom on ETH Bitcoin. 1 to 3 months. Do you see 6-month candles? I want you to look at this. You have a green candle right here. You have a green candle here. Then you have a red. then you have a red, then you have a green, then you have a green, then you have 3 reds in a row. And we're now in our 3rd red in a row, 6-month candle for ETH Bitcoin, right? You can see that, right? 3 in a row. Now, here's the thing about this that I've looked at for a long time. I've really struggled with the best way to interpret it and the way to sort of communicate it to you guys. But there's one thing that I think is important to note. And this is what has made a lot of people feel like ETH Bitcoin is quote unquote holding up well. Again, I've not been of the assumption that it is. I think ETH Bitcoin has been not holding up well at all for the last 2.5 years, but a lot of people have said that it's holding up well. And the reason they say that is because it hasn't seen a big drop, right? If you go look at say quarterly returns, right? Look at quarterly returns for ETH Bitcoin and you'll see what I'm talking about. It's been a slow bleed, so it feels like it isn't happening, right? I mean, look at this. ETH Bitcoin is now red 6 quarters in a row, and it's also been red 8 out of the last 10 quarters. I mean, like, that's not the definition of holding up well if you're bleeding 8 out of 10 quarters. But look at this. A lot of these quarters, it's only dropping like 2% here, 12% there, 5% there, 5% there. And so it feels like it's not a lot, but then you kind of look back on it at some point and you're like, oh, while everyone thought it was holding up well, it still dropped, 47% against Bitcoin. But I want you to look at something here because this is kind of interesting. Do you see this first red candle right here after this green one? You see how large it was? It was a big drop, and then the next 2 were really small, or really small red candles. It was only 24%, 33%, but this one was 50%. Now look at these over here. This one was 12% and this was 15%. So I'm arguing that these 2 candles are like these 2, but perhaps this is the one that comes at the end here to get it down to 0.03 to 0.04, potentially after rejection of the spot ETF in a few weeks. And then it potentially bottoms out in the summer, which is precisely when we've said that Bitcoin dominance, excluding stables, is likely going to top, right? And that's probably when it's going to top, because that's normally when Bitcoin dominance finds a top, is sometime in the summer. And then once you get back into Q3, Q4, the degens return from their summer vacation and they start bidding up alts again. So what if that's the outline, right? What if dominance excluding stables just kind of goes back up to the range high here, not the range high, the top of the wedge. This is 64%, but including stables, it would be 60%. Right as ETH Bitcoin is breaking down to 0.03 to 0.04 following spot ETF rejection. I feel like that is probably the most likely outcome based on what we see. I really do think that is the most likely outcome. And so for me to be bullish on the ETH Bitcoin pair, I first of all think you need looser monetary policy, which is probably going to start in June, but that doesn't mean that the low is in. It means that we're close in terms of time, but not necessarily close in terms of valuation. It could still drop 20% from the current valuation, which might not sound that bad, but there's a reality of if you do drop below that, you're probably going to stay below that for like a year until you durably get back above it. In fact, if you look at it over here, once we dropped below in June of 2019, we had some wicks back above it, but we didn't durably get back above it until June of 2020. It took a year. So, maybe it doesn't sound like the worst thing in the world for ETH Bitcoin to go down here, but if you go down there, you might spend the next year down there before going back up. And remember,
ETH USD wasn't really doing that well when ETH Bitcoin was down here. ETH Bitcoin had bottomed, but ETH USD was still stuck in traffic on Struggle Street until looser monetary policy, until really the Fed turned the money printer back on, right? While looser monetary policy had arrived in Q3 of the pre-halving year back then, we didn't really see the money printer come back on in sort of all its glory until the halving year. So that is my view on the ETH Bitcoin pair, and I think I've made my case for it over the last 2.5 years. I'd like to think it's been helpful for some of you, for some of the viewers It's not fun. It's certainly not fun being bearish on something that, a lot of people are here because they believe in Ethereum, right? I mean, if you're watching these videos, even if you've been with me on this journey, right? Even if you've been with me on the journey and you agreed 2.5 years ago that ETH Bitcoin was going to go down, I know some of you guys are watching our Bitcoin maxis, and I can empathize with that view too. But the reality is that a lot of you that have been on this journey with me are probably long-term bullish on Ethereum from a fundamentals perspective, and you want to believe in the future of the cryptoverse, and I do too. It's just that I saw this happen last cycle, like this pattern play out, and it was not fun to sort of not be prepared for it. This time, converting your ETH to Bitcoin back over here, it saved you a lot, right? Because not only did you hold a lower risk asset in Bitcoin, now if you wanted to convert your Bitcoin back to ETH, you can essentially double up, right? I mean, you could double up. And it has nothing to do if you're a Bitcoin maxi or not. Even if you're an ETH maxi, there's a lot of people that I've seen people say like they're ETH maxis and they begrudgingly agreed with me back over here. And while they did not like that I was sort of preaching this view, they're like, it makes sense. And now, even if you don't see the capitulation, which I still think you will, even if you don't, they have the luxury to basically double up on their ETH, right? That's what I tell people about like these alt Bitcoin pairs. If you like the altcoin so much that you think is the best thing in the world, it would be prudent for you to understand its Bitcoin valuation, because that's how the cryptoverse works, right? There are phases where no matter what altcoin it is, it's going to bleed against Bitcoin. And if you can identify that phase and just stick with Bitcoin through that phase, then you have the luxury to then go pick up that altcoin at nothing on its Bitcoin valuation compared to what you traded it in for initially. So that's why I say, if you really are super bullish on a specific altcoin long term, I think it's still useful to learn about its Bitcoin valuations, because if you can learn about it, then you'll know, okay, well, there's certain phases of the market cycle that might make more sense just to be in Bitcoin, even though I believe in the future of that altcoin, right? Because you're like, all right, these views have nothing to do with Ben's bias on this particular altcoin. It just has to do with, hey, this is what happens when tighter monetary policy arrives. It's nothing personal. It's nothing like that. It's just, this is what happened. High risk bleeds to low risk during this phase of the cycle, where the Fed is stubborn and we're still at high rates and we're still in quantitative tightening. So those are my views. And I think, going forward, if we do see a capitulation by ETH Bitcoin below the range lows, then it likely will sort of kick off the final capitulation process. And I think it's going to happen relatively soon. I mean, it's potentially already happening. And again, you could still see another bump back up for a week or something where people are like, all right, well, maybe it'll still be approved, the ETF. But I still think, as I said before, I think the initial reaction is going to be people pricing it in. And then it's just going to fade once it becomes clearer and clearer as you get closer to the date that it's not actually happening. And then as you get towards that date, then it actually just sort of capitulates below when the market finally accepts that, hey, maybe we're going to have to wait another year or longer before this actually arrives. So that is my view here, right? And if you go back to the 6-month candles that we were talking about earlier, what you'll notice is that last red candle, I mean, the green candle was still kind of near those lows. So that's why I think, while I do think ETH Bitcoin is probably going to bottom this summer, is it in June where it bottoms at the end of this 6-month candle? Or is it in July at the beginning of this 6-month candle? And I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, at that point, if you find ETH Bitcoin at like 0.037 or something in June, I mean, that's probably good enough for me, to sort of flip my view on the ETH Bitcoin valuation. I'm not going to try to pinch sats, to see it go down to wherever it has to go to. But and again, one thing to sort of keep you in check on that is because I know I've talked about Bitcoin dominance potentially topping in June, and there's a chance that happens. But there is this other reality of if you look closely, you'll notice that actually in 2022 it didn't top in June, right? It actually topped in July, about 1 month later, right? It had a top in June, but then it swept that top about 1 month later. So I could see that happening as well, where like it bottoms in June, looser monetary policy arrives, and then maybe it even goes a little bit lower in July / August or something. But if you're finding Bitcoin dominance up at this top of the wedge, and you're finding ETH Bitcoin at like 0.03 to 0.04, you're probably close enough at that point. That would at least be my view on it in terms of like where the low would actually be for the ETH Bitcoin valuation. So that's where we are. By the way, the bull market support band right now for ETH Bitcoin is at 0.0525 to 0.053. So it is continuing to come down. And the reason I provide that update is because that is sort of the line that I think will continue to push ETH Bitcoin down. And it's possible you still wick above it, like 2019 had some wicks above it, but I still think it's going to inevitably bleed back to the downside, take out this low from April, or at least revisit that low within the next couple of weeks, and then probably take it out either later on this month or in June as the final capitulation process arrives and ETH Bitcoin bottoms out. And again, I think it bottoms out I think the capitulation process happens not because of anything to do with the spot ETF. I want to be clear. I'm saying that for the people that really want to assign a narrative to it in crypto. I think it bottoms out in this summer because if you follow the labor market, there's some cracks starting to show, right? And that's just the reality, right? Some cracks are starting to show. And, again, if you look at the unemployment rate, it's those very things that cause the Fed to pivot, right, to looser monetary policy. It's the fact that, we are getting close to that 4% level, and it's probably going to happen this summer. And also, if you look at like ROI after yield curve inversion, and you look at say like this cycle compared to, let me just pick some like random metric here in the Macroverse. What's one that we could look at, right? Something related to like the labor market, right? So we just looked at unemployment. Let's go look at job losers, right? Let's look at job losers. So this would be sort of what the ROI on job losers doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, but basically the performance of job losers, that category after inversion of 3-month and 10-year yield. And you look at it and you're like, all right, it's been going up. It's been going up for a long time. And I know the market doesn't really seem to care, but I go back and I'm like, well, does it look like any other cycle, or is this time really different? And then, going to the pandemic one, I don't really think makes a whole lot of sense because that's not something you're going to like bet everything on. You're not going to be betting on a black swan, right? But if you go to the cycle before that one, the business cycle before that one in 2006, is it different? I don't know. I'm not saying it has to get this bad, but it doesn't really look that different to me. And if you do see it continue to grind higher here, that's just going to make the Fed go to looser monetary policy. So while I think everyone might be freaking out about, ETH Bitcoin because the spot ETF might be rejected, you might actually see ETH Bitcoin bottom out this summer because the labor market is finally showing weakness. And that is what causes the Fed to start to expand their balance sheet. It has nothing to do with the altcoins or anything like that. It just has to do with the labor market. And so that is what I will continue to focus on. And again, remember, even though ETH Bitcoin bottomed out right here, ETH USD still struggled for a little while, right? Again, there's a difference between ETH Bitcoin and ETH USD. Please be aware of that, right? There is a difference between those two metrics. If ETH Bitcoin bottoms, that doesn't necessarily mean anything for ETH USD. ETH USD is going to be very dependent on Bitcoin USD. But I think that ETH Bitcoin is likely going to bottom out sometime in the next few months. And I just want to make sure that, I've communicated my thesis as clear as I can. I could be wrong, right? And if I'm wrong here, then, so be it. In order for me to start questioning that, if we were to get back above the bull market support band and hold it as support, then I would be willing to pivot my view, okay? But it's just been down for years, right? That's just what it's been. And the bull market support band continues to guide us down with occasional rallies above it, but they've all just been fake outs that just drew more people in. They thought it was the bottom, and then it wasn't. I also think the other thing to look at, this is something we talked about a lot in the last cycle, and that is the 20-month moving average. So in the future, some nebulous future date, when ETH Bitcoin gets above the 20-month SMA, that should be confirmation of this phase being over. But I think we're about to sort of enter into that process, right? And then we go back up, and then we take out that 20-month SMA, sometime out in, 2025 or something. Maybe even late 2024. But that is something we talked about a lot, actually, last cycle. Because if you look closely, when ETH Bitcoin had bottomed over here in 2019, all these wicks just kept getting rejected by the 20-month moving average. We did a lot of videos on this. It was like 4 to 5 months of just straight rejections off the 20-month SMA. We finally broke through. And then once we broke through, we then back tested it. We retested out support and then continued to go up. So, that could certainly happen at some point in the future. We're still pretty far away from the 20-month SMA right now. And as last cycle showed, you start to test it as resistance for a few months, likely before you actually get back above it. The 20-month SMA right now is at 0.0615. It's so far above where we currently are. My guess is that, you have sort of this capitulation down. We spend some time down here as the 20-month comes down to it, and then you start to go back up to it, kind of like this, and then you break above it. Kind of like that is what I would generally expect for the ETH Bitcoin pair. But those are my views on the ETH Bitcoin pair, and we will see, in fact, if all of that plays out this summer or not. And if it does not, then I would be looking for, basically, does it get back above the bull market support band to sort of confirm that it's done. Again, my base case is that it bleeds into June and maybe July. But it's always worthwhile to figure out what would invalidate your view or your bias. And so perhaps the bull market support band would be the invalidation, right? If you get above it and you hold it as support, that would be the invalidation of it, right? So here's the 20-week SMA, right? It just continues to mostly stay below that. Well, we're going to wrap it up there. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.